This interview is brought to you in association with Rabobank.
Hi there, welcome to Rural Delivery Online, where we talk to experts, leaders and innovators in our primary sector. The Rabobank Dairy Quarterly Review for the second quarter of 2014 has just been released, and here to discuss the contents of that report is Director of Dairy Research for New Zealand and Asia for Rabobank International, Hayley Moynihan. Hayley, you've just released the Dairy Quarterly. Can you just give us broadly a big picture?
That wave of supply that we've been expecting to come globally because of higher prices and better weather conditions has really arrived, and it's giving those buyers that have missed out in the last 12 months the chance to actually secure some product ahead of China, which has been the issue for the past year or so. And that's also causing a slight easing in prices that is likely to persist for the next 12 months or so.
China is on the buy though, as that's the general trend. As you say, it's causing shortages for some people. How does that actually play out in the marketplace?
It's meant that China's been the most willing to pay the highest price, and that has pushed prices up to these record levels. And a lot of those other buyers have been on diets. So we've had instances where consumers actually haven't been able to purchase product. It simply hasn't been on the shelves. And those that have been able to purchase product have actually been paying a lot more for it. And that does slow up demand, both in rich economies like Europe and the United States, but also in developing and emerging economies as well.
Nightmare for a brand owner. You can't get your product out onto the shelf.
Absolutely, and the product you are getting out is actually costing you a lot more and really squeezing profit margins for those brand owners. And that's a common feature virtually wherever you are in the world.
So, Hayley, what sort of behaviours is that going to drive in terms of the sort of long-term supply agreements that people are going to be looking for?
It means that some of these brand owners and manufacturers are looking at alternative sources of supply, diversifying their supply base, but also looking at using different recipes, utilising ingredients that may be cheaper or easier to source. And that does have longer-term implications for demand growth for dairy, because often when substitution is made, the substitution back to dairy doesn't occur.
Yeah, so what sort of substitutions are we talking about? Can you give us any specific examples?
The growth in things like fat-filled milk powders. So this is skim milk powder that may be fortified with vegetable oils or vegetable fats rather than dairy fats. So a good product for markets where they simply cannot afford a pure dairy product that has both dairy fat and protein in it.
Are we talking about a time now that's finally come where dairy products are essentially food for rich people?
Not entirely. While this ability to diversify the product source or to mix dairy products with cheaper alternatives occurs, it's effectively stretching the milk, and it may be stretching the protein or the fat component with alternatives, but it does still mean these products have a dairy base. It's just a lower proportion than you or I would expect in a relatively wealthy market.
And what does China expect? How would that sort of behaviour go down there?
Yeah, Chinese consumers have become used to quite different dairy products, a lot of flavoured milk beverages, drinking yogurts, things that may not be quite so common in our market, and often those have been a blended product anyway that may not be 100% dairy. So it's part of the evolving tastes and preferences that the stretching of the milk's quite commonplace, so consumers don't notice so much.
One of the things we have seen is that the Chinese are not eating cheese. This is a problem for Fonterra specifically, or particularly in New Zealand, because of their processing capacity for cheese versus whole milk powders. How do you see Fonterra playing that game over the next few years?
Yeah, it's becoming increasingly important to have diversified product and revenue streams across both the commodity groups and more tailored products. And in that respect, New Zealand and Fonterra are still ahead of the game compared to some processors offshore. But it is a balance. It may not always be the case that powders are higher returning, and keeping that balance is going to be the most important going forward.
Okay. If we take a look around the world, what's happening in Europe? We've got the situation with the quota coming off. It'd be good if you could give us a good explanation of exactly what is going to happen there and what the likely effects are going to be.
Sure. So milk production quotas being removed has been signalled for the best part of a decade or two, and that date finally arrives in 12 months' time, March 2015. Milk production's already ramping up in anticipation of that, and processing investment is also increasing, particularly in powder processing. That's with an eye to emerging markets, and European processors are very much looking to compete head-to-head with New Zealand and other exporters. in the emerging markets of Asia, North Africa and the Middle East, and particularly in powder.
Do they have any specific competitive advantage that might help them in that, other than seasonal, of course?
Yeah, the offsetting seasonal advantage is clearly there, and also more established trade relationships into places like North Africa and the Middle East particularly. Geographic proximity helps, but also historical trade ties have helped, and probably give somewhat of an edge in that market. The reverse is true, of course, for us in Asia, where New Zealand and Australia hold an advantage in that region.
Do the Europeans have the capacity to grow their volumes at the same pace that New Zealand was able to, particularly in light of environmental constraints, which are particularly marked in a lot of areas of Europe?
Some of the percentage growth in the early years from quota removal will probably exceed what we've seen in New Zealand for some countries, particularly in Ireland. But environmental constraints will come to bear. Nevertheless, we'd expect to see around about another 9 billion litres out of Europe by 2020 on a per annum basis, so almost half as much as New Zealand's production again by the time we get to that point. Significant volumes, but we do think the world market needs it in terms of the additional demand coming from emerging markets.
Demand isn't coming from within Europe. You're not looking at any stellar increase there, perhaps some slow, steady growth?
Yeah, slow and steady is really the best to hope for, and even incremental percentage growth in Europe is all we expect to see domestically. So that milk, by and large, will reach export markets.
And the US?
The US will also be a large contributor to filling that import growth in the global market. And with competitive feed costs and efficient large-scale farming systems, we expect to make more of a mark and provide more competition, particularly in Asia.
Interesting situation in the US, Hayley. With changes in the global market, how's that going to affect the import-export balance for that country?
It's making a huge difference in the US and has already taken a lot of domestic inventory out of the US system and put it on the world market. Going forward, the biggest challenge for them is to actually see international price signals reflected for producers and incentivising that milk production. The regulatory system in the US is probably one of their biggest challenges to enable that transmission of world price signals to actually be felt at the farm gate.
These countries which are starting to become greater exporters, say the US, how much of a threat is that to New Zealand? Is that simply good? Other people are out there meeting the demand. We can't do it all. We need them there to feed that demand. Or should we be starting to get worried that they might start getting as good at it as we are?
Yeah, I think it's certainly the case that they'll provide a new competitive edge in the marketplace. But the case that New Zealand simply can't fulfil this demand is absolutely correct. And New Zealand's share of the global traded market in dairy likely peaked around about 2012 because we just don't have the ability to produce the additional volumes required. It is going to force us to continue to strive for increased efficiency and providing increased value to the market, which I think is healthy in terms of keeping us on our toes.
Closer to home, what's it looking like in Australia?
Australia have had a tough year. Climatic conditions have certainly impacted, and they haven't been able to really take advantage of these high prices available. That does seem to be turning, and certainly a lot of activity in the processing part of the market in Australia as some rationalisation and change of ownership occurs.
We better take a look at South America, again a region quite capable of being hugely competitive with New Zealand. What's the broad picture there? I know we've got a lot of countries involved. Is it possible to draw one South American picture, or do we need to have a look at specific producers?
Overall, most of the countries in South America are running pretty fast to keep up with their own internal demand, or at least internal subcontinent demand, products being exported out of Argentina and Uruguay, for example, to help meet the demands in Brazil and Venezuela and other countries. It is still growing in terms of milk production, but some internal challenges, particularly highlighted by the recent Argentinian decision to stop issuing export licenses. So some local challenges around their own systems.
You're forecasting an overall tail off in this growth of Chinese demand. What is that going to look like over the next few years across the bigger picture of global supply?
We expect Chinese production to at least stabilise. The impact of these very large-scale farms starting to play a bigger role in lifting milk production. But it is expensive milk to be produced in China, and for that reason we expect them to remain the largest importer globally and still to make quite large calls on the global market. that will help sustain firmer prices going forward and certainly above averages seen over the last 10 years. So the Chinese influence, while the edge may come off, is certainly not going to disappear altogether.
Hayley, it's fascinating stuff. Always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Roger.
This interview was brought to you in association with Rabobank.